today's podcast is not really going to talk about the study, but sort of the general professional values, let's put it that way, or etiquette that consultants should apply on a project. So obviously we're dealing with a North African and Middle Eastern client, and they are very different from us. And we're dealing with a culture we don't really understand well. And obviously their value system is different, the food they eat is different, the music they listen to is different. And even if you move from the regional offices to the regional offices for this one client, things change quite dramatically, right? Because they're spread across 17 countries. They have a research center in Poland, they've got operations in Saudi Arabia, Tunisia, Algeria, Nigeria, Mauritania. You can't really compare them. Now, what I'm going to talk about here is the things we do that sometimes alienates us from the clients. And I think that this is a problem whenever we are too sure of ourselves. And the reason I say that because I think in the West we have this view that our way is the right way and there's no one else that can teach us anything. I'm going to give you some simple examples of what I'm referring to. And rather than giving you a laundry list of everything you want to avoid, I'm going to talk about some principles. And these principles apply across every issue. So we were sitting in the office the other day. I believe we were picking a place to go out for dinner that night as a team, right? So we had the client there and we were all going to go out. And we were picking places. And someone recommended, let's go here. They've got some great African food. And someone said, let's go here, blah, blah, blah. And then someone said, let's go here, right? And then one of the younger consultants queried and said, what kind of food is that? And then one of the consultants was explaining, well, the food in this restaurant is fish with usually rice as an accompaniment. And the consultant made the response, basically something along the lines of, yuck, I don't ever eat rice. It's just terrible food. Now, I don't think she meant to offend anyone. And I don't think she could have known she was offending someone. But rice is a staple in this country. So when you have a reaction like that, you are offending someone. Now, the principle here is, and this is a very important principle, in the West, we are treated as if we must have strong opinions and tell everyone about it. My philosophy is don't have a strong opinion on anything when you're a consultant, except business. And even if you do have a strong opinion, you can say it in a more sensitive way, right? But the first rule is don't have a strong opinion. Don't have a strong opinion about politics. Don't have a strong opinion about sports. Don't have a strong opinion about food. Have an acceptable opinion. Be open-minded rather than being adamant and polarized, right? Because I did think she offended someone. The other time we were out and someone made the comment about why these women are covered up in burqas, this traditional garb in parts of the Middle East, and I think most Muslim cultures have some variation of this. And I remember one consultant saying, I can't believe anyone would want to work in a culture like this and live here. And I'm just thinking to myself, okay, I know what this consultant is thinking. The client's not there, that's why he's speaking that way. But the way I view this is that if this is what you think, if you think this culture is inferior, what in the world are you doing here advising them? It's like, if you think something is inferior, you don't think it's worthy of your time and effort. And you probably don't give it the quality, time, and effort it deserves. Worse, I'm thinking what this consultant thinks of me, where he thinks that I would condone such a comment. And I actually had to speak to him and say, look, you cannot do things like that. You cannot criticize a culture. When you chose to be in this project, when we asked you to be on this project and you chose to be in this project, you have accepted this nation's culture, even though you may disagree with it. When you choose to work in a nation, you accept their culture. You don't just choose to accept their money and the training you're going to get and the experience. You choose to accept their culture. We may not agree with their culture. We may not like their culture. That doesn't give us a right to criticize their culture. And I don't think everyone sees it that way, but this concept of being polarizing in the West is not a good idea. Now, there's a third thing that I want you to be aware of, and this, again, is something that's very common in the West, especially the US and Canada. Let's assume two people are talking about a political party. One person is Republican and one person is Democrat, right? Now, let's assume one person believes, privatizing everything makes sense, and the other one believes, no, government needs to run key parts of the economy. Now, this is the one thing I noticed that happens a lot with consultants. If person A believes in the Democrat view and person B believes in the Republican view, for some weird reason, both people think they need to convince the other one to accept their view. And this is the thing I don't understand. If you have a different view, why do you think it is your job to convince everyone to think like you? I never really understood that about the West. Because you see the heated debates people have. Why do you think this? Sometimes people ask me what I think. And I'll give my point and I'll say, but why do you say that? Don't you think that it's wrong, blah, blah, blah. And you can see that the reason they're asking that question is because they work on this implicit assumption that they need to convince me to change my mind. And if I believe I'm right, I need to convince them to change their mind. And I always politely tell people, look, I understand my views are different, but I'm comfortable if you have a different viewpoint. I think it's even good you have a different viewpoint because then it forces me to see a different perspective. So the point I'm trying to make is don't get involved in this debate whereby you have to convince the other person they are wrong. I don't get that. How does convincing the other person they are wrong make you a better person? How does it change anything, right? So when you have a viewpoint, it's your viewpoint. Don't believe that other people need to accept it, right? Fourth point I want to make here, culture. Little things go a long way when it comes to respecting cultural traits, right? So, for example, I think it was maybe a Thursday night on the study. And again, clearly we eat out a lot as consultants and drink. We were finding a place we could go to with the team to have dinner, right? And I remember one of the consultants was stating that, one of the clients was stating, look, in our culture, it's very common to invite the following people because, it just shows respect towards elders. So that I think that even though you haven't invited these team members, I think you should, because that's normal in our culture. And remember one of the consultants getting so agitated about it because, this is not our culture, this is not how we do things. Now, I think it's an example of not showing respect. Respect is accepting and tolerating that which you see, even if you disagree with it. Now, there's a fifth lesson here, which you may not have picked up. The fifth lesson is that when these things happen, I really am a bit concerned about my selection criteria for consultants or the way I manage the team, that they think these things are acceptable. Now, given the incredible amount of podcasts and material we have out there, it is very obvious where we stand on things. People know we don't stand for these things. But somehow, as they get onto the study, and as I become friendly with the team and so on, they kind of think that they can be themselves. I always tell people, you must be yourself unless you're a jerk. Then don't be yourself. And one of the things I've learned throughout this entire process is that while I need to have very good relationships with the consultants, I also need to understand that I need to create a culture, an environment where they understand that certain things are definitely out of boundaries on the project and they cannot breach that value system. And I would say I'm not being too good about that. So, people listening to this will say, wow, that consultant shouldn't have been hired, blah, blah, blah. But I think there's also a lesson here for the partners, especially myself, whereby did we select people correctly? Second, if we selected people, you can't really test these things in an interview process, but once we brought them in, did we constantly reinforce our values correctly? What did they do initially? Remember broken windows theory? People do little things first before deciding they can do the big thing. What are the little things they did first to test us that made them think they can say things like this in front of the client? Why is it that when it happened once in week 2, people thought they could do it in week 4? Obviously, we didn't react to this rightly to close it down immediately. So the way I look at this is that while it is obviously a learning on the side of the consultants, I think it is actually a bigger learning on the side of the leadership for the project. I don't think we closed up the issues fast enough. I don't think we educated fast enough. I certainly felt that at some point in the study, I kind of said, this is a stupid comment, let it go, don't judge the person for the one thing, and then they'll repeat it in a week's time. And that's my failure, right? It is a big failure because after a while, people start saying this is okay, and I'm not saying everyone does it, but variations of this occur. So the lesson for me is not so much about the consultants, but it's how we manage these things when they happen, because the reality is that it's going to happen a lot in a study, especially when you've got so many nationalities traveling around different parts of the continent, trying to deal with the study, right? And if anything, I wouldn't say I was particularly harsh on the consultants, but I did realize that when we run these studies, we have to be far more careful in making it very clear what we accept. And when people step out of line, we don't have to punish them, but I think it's much easier to talk to them earlier rather than letting things step out of line. So that's my view on these things, right? I don't feel the consultants were 100% to blame. I don't even think they were 40% to blame. I think they were maybe 25% to blame. Somewhere along the lines, we allowed this behavior to permeate and percolate, and we shouldn't have. And to be honest, I do rack my brain thinking about, was there a signal earlier? How do we respond to these things? Why did it escalate so much? What in the world would make this consultant say he could make such a discriminatory comment in front of me and think that I would be okay with it? What signals did I give him that tell him that I'd be okay with it? So those are the kind of things I worry about, right? And this is not something that I've only recently discovered. I remember when I was an associate and we were doing a project in some country in the Middle East, and I was sitting down with a manager, a project leader, and this lady just goes off on a tangent insulting the office leadership about how incompetent they are, they don't know anything, they're going to be replaced soon. Now, you could always say, you know what, it's her fault. But I was thinking to myself, what in the world makes her think that it's okay for her to give me her problems? Why does she think that I'll be okay with it? What does it say about me? One of the things I've learned is that the signals we send to other people usually determines the way they're going to respond to us. And after these incidents on the study, and after that incident in the Middle East, when I was much younger, I did reorient my approach. I became tougher. I close out problems much faster. People say I'm a lot more difficult, but it's better. And I think on the power sector study, what has happened is that when I left consulting many years ago, I obviously took over firms consulting and started running it. For a long time, we didn't do studies, and then last year we started doing studies. I think I've become a little bit soft in managing these things. But you only need to be telling me once I've gone soft, and I've obviously tightened the screws quite a bit. So now as you are getting involved in situations like this, and you experience these moments when people say dumb things, it's one thing to say this person is an idiot, don't listen to them. The other thing you've got to think about is, why did this person think it's okay to behave this way in front of you? That's something we never think about. And I would argue it's more important to think about that than to just worry whether this person has a screw loose. Because if you're putting out some kind of signal or not responding to these things, you are implicitly condoning it. And you don't want to be in that situation. You're going to be the kind of person that when people are around you, they understand the standards are much higher. And one of the things I tried to do in the power sector studies, given the challenges, the difficulties, I was maybe too friendly with the consultants. I'm not saying I'm going to be any tougher, but I'm definitely going to be more focused on closing out any early warnings for things that can go wrong. And as always, if you have any comments or suggestions or any questions, please feel free to post them, and I'll be more than happy to respond to them.